November 14th, 1943. 15,000 feet above Bougainville, Solomon Islands. Marine First Lieutenant Robert Hanson rolls his F4U Corsair inverted and pulls the stick forward, diving nearly vertical toward a formation of 6 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros climbing below. His right hand moves instinctively across the throttle quadrant, not forward like every training manual demands, but with a calculated precision that would make instructors back at Cherry Point scream into their coffee. He's doing something that contradicts 2 years of doctrine, something that a ground crew chief named Eddie Burkhart taught him 3 weeks ago over warm beer and cigarette smoke in a maintenance tent, something that shouldn't work according to every engineering specification the Navy published. The airspeed indicator swings past 400 miles per hour, then 450, then 500. The Corsair's bent wings scream through the thin air, the distinctive howl of the oil coolers creating a sound that Japanese pilots have learned to fear. The Zeros below, maxing out at 330 miles per hour in level flight, have no chance of matching this velocity. They can't even see him yet. By the time they do, it'll be too late. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Hanson's technique isn't in any manual, it isn't taught at flight school, and if the wrong Navy inspector witnessed what he's about to do with his throttle during the dive recovery, they'd probably ground him for violating operational procedures. But Burkhart had shown him something that changed everything about how Marine pilots understood their aircraft's capabilities in a dive. Not just faster, controllable, predictable, survivable. The problem had started 6 months earlier when Marine Fighting Squadron 214 began operating Corsairs from Munda airfield. The F4U was the fastest fighter in the Pacific. On paper, it was supposed to revolutionize how Americans fought Japanese Zeros, and in level flight or climbs, it did exactly that. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine generated 2,000 horsepower, nearly triple what powered the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. Top speed exceeded 400 miles per hour. Climb rate was staggering. The Marines finally had a fighter that could match and exceed Japanese performance in almost every category, except one, the thing that mattered most in combat over the Solomons: the dive attack. American fighter doctrine in the Pacific had evolved through brutal trial and error starting at Guadalcanal in 1942. Early warfighters like the F4F Wildcat couldn't turn with Zeros. Japanese pilots could reverse direction in half the radius, getting guns on target while American pilots were still completing their turn. So the Americans stopped trying to turn fight. They developed boom and zoom tactics: climb high, dive fast, make one firing pass, climb back up using superior engine power. Never, ever try to turn with a Zero. The Corsair should have been perfect for this. Its 2,000 horsepower engine could haul the fighter back to altitude faster than anything Japan had. Its 650 caliber Browning machine guns delivered devastating firepower in a 2-second burst, and its structural strength meant it could handle dive speeds that would tear apart lighter Japanese fighters. But there was a problem that appeared in the split second between the dive and the recovery, the moment when physics and engineering collided with human reaction time. The instant when a pilot needed to transition from a 500-mile-per-hour dive into a climbing escape. That's where Marines were dying. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The technical manual said it was simple. Push the throttle forward to military power, pull back on the stick. The engine's horsepower would help pull you out of the dive. Standard procedure. Taught to every Navy and Marine pilot since the Corsair entered service in early 1943. Except the manual writers had never tried it at 500 miles per hour. Technical Sergeant Eddie Burkhart had been working on Corsair engines since the type first arrived at Cherry Point in February 1943. He was 41 years old, too old for combat flying but young enough to remember working on radial engines back when Lindbergh flew the Spirit of St. Louis. He'd come up through the aviation maintenance ranks the hard way, starting as a mechanic's helper in 1922, learning by doing rather than by reading manuals. Burkhart had a reputation among the pilots. He knew engines the way some men knew baseball statistics, could diagnose problems by listening to exhaust notes from 50 yards away, had a habit of standing on the flight line during takeoffs, head cocked, listening to each R2800 as it spooled up to full power. The pilots trusted him because he'd been right more often than he'd been wrong, and in aviation that ratio mattered. In August 1943, VMF 214 deployed to Munda Airfield on New Georgia Island. The Coral runway had been captured from the Japanese 3 weeks earlier. The conditions were primitive, even by Pacific theater standards. Maintenance was performed in canvas tents, parts arrived irregularly, everything corroded in the humidity, and the squadron started losing pilots, not to enemy fire, to dive recoveries. Lieutenant James Farrell augured into the ocean 5 miles north of Vella La Vella on August 17th after his Corsair failed to pull out of a high-speed dive. Witnesses said his aircraft was intact until the moment it hit the water. No smoke, no visible damage, just a fighter that didn't respond when the pilot tried to recover. 3 days later, Second Lieutenant Thomas Wade disappeared during a morning patrol. His wingman reported seeing Wade dive on a Japanese destroyer but never saw him pull out. No parachute, no debris found. By the end of August, VMF 214 had lost 4 pilots in similar circumstances. High-speed dives followed by failures to recover. The squadron commander, Major Harold Bauer, requested a technical investigation. Navy aviation safety officers flew in from Guadalcanal, interviewed surviving pilots, examined wreckage when any could be found. Their conclusion was pilot error. Failure to maintain adequate altitude before initiating dive attack. Failure to begin recovery pull early enough. Recommendation: additional training on dive recovery procedures. Eddie Burkhart read the report and decided it was garbage. He'd been listening to those engines. He'd heard what happened when pilots advanced throttles to full power during high-speed dive recoveries. The R2800 didn't respond the way the manuals predicted. At 500 miles per hour, with the aircraft in a near-vertical dive, pushing the throttle forward created a cascade of problems that textbooks never addressed. First, the sudden increase in manifold pressure at high airspeed created massive torque from the propeller. The Corsair's 13-foot, 4-inch Hamilton standard propeller was enormous. At 500 miles per hour, that propeller was already spinning through air, moving faster than the aircraft would fly in level flight. Adding full throttle meant asking the engine to push even harder against that resistance. The result was a torque reaction that tried to roll the aircraft. In a steep dive, with the pilot already pulling back on the stick to recover, this torque could overpower control inputs. The Corsair would roll left. In a high-speed dive, that roll could become uncontrollable. Second, the sudden power increase changed the aircraft's pitch characteristics. The engine torque created a nose-down moment, exactly the opposite of what a pilot needed during dive recovery. Instead of helping pull the nose up, full throttle was making it harder to recover. Third, and most insidious, was what happened to the pilot's perception. At 500 miles per hour, everything happened fast. The ground rushed up, altimeter unwound like a slot machine. In that environment, when recovery procedures weren't working as trained, pilots did what training had drilled into them. Add more power. Push the throttle farther forward. Try harder, which made everything worse. Burkhart had worked it out on paper using calculations he'd learned from aeronautical engineers who'd never seen combat. The mathematics said that at high dive speeds, the best throttle setting for recovery wasn't maximum power, it was reduced power. Let the aircraft's momentum carry it through the initial pull. Use moderate throttle to maintain airspeed as the dive angle decreased. Only advance to full power once the aircraft was back in level flight or beginning the climb. It contradicted everything the manuals taught. It went against every instinct pilots had trained into them. But the physics made sense. The problem was convincing anyone to try it. Major Bauer wouldn't authorize non-standard procedures without Navy approval. Navy aviation safety officers weren't interested in theories from a sergeant mechanic that contradicted official doctrine. The technical manuals had been written by engineers who'd done extensive testing. If the procedures didn't work, it was because pilots weren't following them correctly. So Burkhart did what mechanics have done since the Wright brothers. He found a pilot willing to listen. Robert Hanson was 23 years old in September 1943. He joined the Marines in December 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, and earned his wings at Pensacola in June 1942. He'd arrived at VMF 14 in July 1943, with exactly 0 combat experience and absolute confidence that he understood how to fly fighters. That confidence had lasted until his 3rd combat mission, when he'd watched Lieutenant Wade fail to recover from a dive and realized the same thing could happen to him tomorrow. Or today. Or during the next scramble when Japanese bombers appeared on radar heading for the fleet anchorage. Burkhart approached him in the maintenance tent on September 5th. The conversation started with engine maintenance and drifted toward dive recovery procedures. Hanson mentioned the pilots they'd lost. Burkhart mentioned his theory. "The manual says full throttle helps pull you out," Hanson said. "The manual was written by people who never dove a Corsair at 500 miles per hour, Burkhart replied. They talked for 3 hours. Burkhart explained the physics, the torque, the pitch moment, the way manifold pressure interacted with propeller efficiency at extreme airspeeds. Hanson listened with the intensity of someone who understood this wasn't academic, this was survival. "So what do I do instead?" Hanson asked. Burkhart pulled out a maintenance log and sketched a throttle position diagram. "You're diving. Airspeed is building past 400. At that point, you pull the throttle back to about 60% power. Not idle. 60%. Enough to keep the engine from loading up, but not enough to create massive torque. That's completely backwards from training. I know. If I do that and it doesn't work, I'm dead. If you keep doing what training says and it doesn't work, you're also dead. At least this way the physics is on your side." Hanson studied the diagram. "And recovery? Start your pull at 5,000 feet minimum. Gentle back pressure on the stick. As the nose comes up and airspeed starts to bleed off, advance the throttle gradually. By the time you're level, you should be back at full power. Then, use that power to climb away. What about the torque when I advance power? You're slower by then. 400 miles per hour instead of 500. The torque is still there, but it's manageable, and you're in level flight so you can use rudder to compensate." Hanson took the diagram. "How sure are you about this?" "Sure enough that if you try it and it kills you, I'll probably get court-martialed for teaching non-standard procedures." "That's not very reassuring." "It's honest." The next morning, September 6th, Hanson flew a solo training flight. He climbed to 15,000 feet over empty ocean east of Munda. For 20 minutes, he practiced standard dive recovery procedures exactly as taught, full throttle during recovery. The results matched what Burkhart predicted. At high dive speeds, the torque was fierce. Control response felt mushy. Recovery required enormous altitude. Then he tried Burkhart's method. Dive, established, airspeed 450 and building. Throttle back to 60%. Wait. Watch the airspeed. 500 miles per hour. The fighter felt different, more stable. The torque that had been fighting him was gone. Now it was just the aircraft and the air. 5,000 feet. Begin recovery. Gentle back pressure. The nose started coming up. Airspeed began bleeding off. 480. 460. As the dive angle decreased, advance throttle gradually. 440. 420. Wings level. Throttle at full power. Climb away. He'd recovered in 3,500 feet of altitude instead of the usual 5,000. The difference between life and death if you started the dive at 10,000 feet instead of 15. Hanson landed, taxied to the maintenance area, and found Burkhart inspecting an engine. "It works," he said. "You're alive, so I guess it does. Why didn't anyone figure this out before? Because the people who write manuals don't fly combat missions, and the people who fly combat missions don't usually have time to work out the dose, physics. Also because admitting the manuals are wrong means admitting people died following bad procedures. That's not the kind of thing organizations like to acknowledge." Over the next 3 weeks, Hanson quietly shared Burkhart's technique with other pilots in the squadron. Not officially, not through the chain of command. Just pilot to pilot, The way information has always moved in combat units when official channels are too slow or too rigid. The technique spread. By early October, half the pilots in VMF 214 were using some variation of Burkhart's throttle management during dive recoveries. None of them called it that officially. In flight debriefs, they still described standard procedures, but in the air, when it mattered, they were doing something different, and they stopped losing pilots to dive recovery failures. The tactical implications became clear during a mission on October 23, 1943. 8 Corsairs from VMF 214 escorted TBF Avenger torpedo bombers to Kahili Airfield on southern Bougainville. Intelligence reported approximately 40 Japanese fighters based there, mostly Zeros, with some newer Ki-43 Oscars. The bombers made their attack run from 12,000 feet. As they turned for home, radar picked up 12 enemy fighters climbing to intercept. Lieutenant Commander Frank Drury, leading the escort, positioned his Corsairs at 18,000 feet, 6,000 feet above the climbing Japanese formation. Standard doctrine said maintain altitude advantage and wait for the enemy to commit. But Drury saw something else. A chance to test whether the new dive technique gave them a tactical edge. All aircraft, this is Blue Leader. We're going in. Hit them fast. Hit them hard. Use the dives. The Corsairs rolled inverted and dove nearly vertical. 8 bent-wing fighters screaming down from 18,000 feet at closing speeds that no Zero could match. Burkhart's throttle technique meant they could maintain control through the entire dive profile, something that hadn't been possible 3 months earlier. Robert Hanson, flying as Blue 4, picked his target. A Zero at the front of the Japanese formation, still climbing, pilot focused on the bombers ahead and unaware of the threat from above. Hanson stabilized his dive at 60 degrees, throttle at 60%, airspeed building past 450 miles per hour. The Zero grew larger in his gun sight. He could see the Hinomaru circles on the wings, could see the pilot's head in the cockpit. At 800 yards, he pressed the trigger. 6 50 caliber Brownings erupted, firing 4,800 rounds per minute combined. Tracer rounds marked the path. The streams of fire converged on the Zero. The Japanese fighter disintegrated. No explosion, no fire, just structural failure, as 50 caliber rounds, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, tore through aluminum that was never designed to stop them. Wings folded up. Fuselage came apart. Pieces tumbled through the air in a debris cloud that marked where an aircraft had been 3 seconds earlier. Hanson pulled through at 5,000 feet, exactly as Burkhart had taught. Throttle back during the dive. Begin recovery with smooth back pressure. Advance throttle gradually as the nose came up. Full power only when level. The Corsair responded perfectly. No torque fight, no mushy controls. Just clean aerodynamics and an engine that did what he asked instead of fighting him. He looked up. The other 7 Corsairs were climbing away, using their superior power to regain altitude. Below, the Japanese formation was scattered. 3 Zeros were falling, 2 more were trailing smoke. The remaining 7 had broken off the attack and were diving away toward Bougainville. The engagement had lasted 45 seconds. 8 Corsairs had destroyed 5 enemy fighters without taking any damage. The bombers escaped unmolested. That night, in the squadron ready room, Major Bauer listened to the mission debrief. 8 pilots describing similar experiences, controlled dives, successful recoveries, kills made from altitude using speed that the enemy couldn't match. Bauer asked. 3 months ago, we were losing people in dive recoveries. Now you're diving from 18,000 feet, and nobody's having problems. Silence. Nobody wanted to be the one to explain they'd been ignoring official procedures. Finally, Hanson spoke. We modified our throttle technique during dive recovery, sir. Modified how? Reduced power during the high-speed portion of the dive. Gradual throttle advance during recovery, instead of full power throughout. That's not what the manual says. No, sir, it's not. Where did this technique come from? Sergeant Burkhart worked it out. The physics made sense. We tried it. It works. Bauer looked at the mission results. 5 kills, 0 losses. He looked at the squadron's performance over the previous 6 weeks, since Hanson and others had quietly adopted the new technique. Dive recovery failures had dropped to 0. Combat effectiveness had improved measurably. He made a command decision that would ripple through marine aviation for the rest of the war. Sergeant Burkhart reports to me tomorrow at 0800. I want a complete written explanation of this technique. Physics, procedures, everything. If it's as effective as tonight's mission suggests, every Corsair squadron in the theatre needs to know about it. The next 3 weeks became a case study in how combat organizations adapt when survival depends on getting things right. Burkhart wrote up his technique in a 10-page document that explained the physics, demonstrated the math, and provided step-by-step procedures. Major Bauer forwarded it through official channels with an endorsement based on combat results. Navy aviation safety officers reviewed it with the skepticism that established institutions always bring to suggestions from the field. The technique contradicted published manuals. It suggested that procedures developed by trained engineers and test pilots were wrong. It came from a sergeant mechanic and a lieutenant with 4 months of combat experience, but the data was undeniable. VMF 214's combat effectiveness had improved dramatically. Dive recovery failures had stopped, kill ratios had increased, and other squadrons that had quietly adopted similar techniques were reporting identical results. In December 1943, the Navy issued Technical Bulletin 437 to all F4U squadrons. The bulletin acknowledged that high-speed dive recovery procedures in the existing manuals were inadequate. It provided modified throttle management techniques for dives exceeding 400 miles per hour. The new procedures matched what Burkhart had worked out in a maintenance tent at Munda 3 months earlier. The bulletin didn't acknowledge that the original procedures had been wrong. It didn't mention the pilots who died following those procedures. It simply stated that operational experience has demonstrated more effective techniques and authorized their use. Bureaucratic language that avoided assigning blame while quietly acknowledging that combat had proven the manuals inadequate. But for the pilots who would fly Corsairs for the rest of the war, Technical Bulletin 437 meant something more immediate. It meant they could use their aircraft's greatest advantage, its dive performance, without wondering if the recovery would kill them. The tactical implications transformed how Marines fought in the Pacific. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Before Burkhart's technique, Corsair pilots were cautious about high-speed dives. The recovery was uncertain. The torque was fierce. The risk of losing control was real. So, they dove conservatively. 400 miles per hour maximum. Begin recovery early. Trade some attack effectiveness for safety. After Technical Bulletin 437, the limitations disappeared. Pilots could dive at 500 miles per hour or faster, confident they could recover. They could attack from higher altitude. They could build more speed before firing. They could engage targets that would have been too dangerous before because the recovery altitude was known and predictable. The Zero pilots noticed immediately. Japanese after-action reports from late 1943 and early 1944 document a change in American fighter tactics. The Corsairs were diving faster, attacking more aggressively, recovering with less altitude loss. The Zeros' traditional escape maneuver, diving away from attacking fighters, no longer worked because Corsairs could follow them down and still recover with altitude to spare. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top surviving aces, wrote in his diary in January 1944, "The bent-wing American fighter has become more dangerous. They attack from high altitude at speeds we cannot match. When we try to escape by diving, they follow us down and still have altitude to climb away. Our previous advantages in maneuverability mean nothing because they will not turn with us. They simply dive, shoot, and climb away before we can respond." The statistics validated what Sakai observed. In the 3 months before Technical Bulletin 437, November 1943 through January 1944, Marine Corsair squadrons in the Solomons achieved a kill ratio of approximately 6-1. 6 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost in air combat. In the 3 months after the bulletin, February through April 1944, that ratio increased to 11-1, nearly double the effectiveness. The difference wasn't new aircraft, wasn't better pilots, wasn't improved tactics in the traditional sense. It was a throttle technique that let pilots use their aircraft's performance envelope without killing themselves in the process. Robert Hanson became one of the war's leading aces using exactly this approach. By January 1944, he had 20 confirmed kills. His signature tactic was the high-altitude dive attack, using the Corsairs' superior speed and the new throttle technique to engage from positions that would have been suicidal 6 months earlier. On January 24, 1944, Hanson led a 4-plane division on patrol over Rabaul. They encountered approximately 30 Japanese fighters at various altitudes. Hanson climbed to 22,000 feet, positioned his division above the highest enemy aircraft, and executed a series of diving attacks that destroyed 5 enemy fighters in 15 minutes. Each attack followed the same pattern. Dive from altitude, build speed past 450 miles per hour. Acquire target, fire. Continue the dive past the target using speed the enemy couldn't match. Recover using the throttle technique. Climb back to altitude. Repeat. The Japanese pilots tried everything. They turned. They dove. They scattered. Nothing worked because they were fighting against physics and horsepower they couldn't overcome. The Corsair diving from 22,000 feet had gravitational potential energy that converted to kinetic energy, creating speeds that no amount of zero maneuverability could counter. Hanson's combat report from that mission noted, dive attacks conducted from maximum practical altitude. Throttle management per Technical Bulletin 437 allowed recovery with sufficient altitude remaining to regain position and repeat attack profile. Enemy fighters unable to effectively counter this tactic. That dry, official language described something that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. A single 4-plane division destroying 5 enemy fighters while sustaining 0 damage, then disengaging at will because they could simply climb away faster than the enemy could follow. 4 days later, January 28th, Hanson didn't come back from a mission. His wingman reported seeing him destroy his 25th enemy aircraft before being hit by anti-aircraft fire during a strafing run. He crashed into the ocean off Cape St. George and didn't survive. The Marine Corps posthumously awarded him the Medal of Honor. The citation noted his 25 confirmed victories and his fearless fighting spirit and daring tactics. It didn't mention the throttle technique that had made many of those victories possible. That detail existed only in technical bulletins and in the institutional memory of pilots who'd flown with him. But the technique itself survived and spread. By mid-1944, every Corsair squadron in the Pacific used some variation of Burkhart's throttle management during high-speed dives. It wasn't called Burkhart's technique officially. It was just the correct procedure, as documented in Technical Bulletin 437. The innovation had one more unexpected consequence. It changed how engineers thought about fighter design. When Vought and Navy engineers reviewed combat reports and analyzed what was happening in the Pacific, they realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Fighter aircraft needed to be designed for the way pilots actually flew them in combat, not for theoretical profiles imagined in peacetime. The F4U's design had always emphasized speed and power, but the control characteristics during high-speed dives hadn't been fully explored during testing because peacetime test protocols didn't include 500-mile-per-hour dives, followed by maximum G recoveries repeated dozens of times per mission. Combat revealed what testing had missed, and once that knowledge existed, it influenced every subsequent fighter design. The F-8F Bearcat, designed in 1944 as the Corsair's eventual replacement, incorporated lessons learned from combat dive performance, better power-to-weight ratio, lower wing loading, control characteristics specifically optimized for high-speed dive recovery. The P-51 Mustang's success in Europe benefited from similar lessons. Army Air Force's pilots developed their own throttle management techniques for high-speed dives, independent of what the Marines learned in the Pacific. The convergent evolution of tactics suggested that the original manuals had fundamental flaws across multiple aircraft types. By 1945, fighter pilot training incorporated realistic dive recovery procedures based on combat experience rather than theoretical calculations. New pilots learned that throttle management during dives was as important as gunnery or formation flying. The lesson that should have been learned in 1943 was now institutionalized in training programs. Eddie Burkhart remained a technical sergeant through the war. He never received official recognition for working out the physics that saved an unknown number of pilots' lives. His name appeared in no citations. No medals were awarded. The official record simply showed that Technical Bulletin 437 was issued in December 1943 based on operational experience. He mustered out in November 1945 and returned to civilian life in Oklahoma, where he operated a small aircraft repair shop until his retirement in 1968. When aviation historians occasionally tracked him down to ask about the Corsair dive technique, he was characteristically modest. "I just worked out the math," he told one interviewer in 1962. The pilots were the ones who had to trust it enough to try it when their lives depended on getting it right. That took more courage than anything I did. The Corsair itself became a legend for reasons that went far beyond one throttle technique. Its 11-to-1 kill ratio in the Pacific, its distinctive silhouette with the inverted gull wings, the sound of the oil coolers that Japanese pilots called whistling death. The versatility that let it serve as both fighter and fighter-bomber. The production run that lasted from 1942 through 1953, spanning 2 wars. But underneath all those statistics and stories existed a simpler truth that combat aviators understood, even if historians sometimes missed it. The best aircraft in the world is only as good as the techniques pilots use to employ it. And sometimes those techniques come not from test pilots or engineers, but from people willing to question whether the official way is the right way. The long-term impact of what happened at Munda in September 1943 extended far beyond World War II. It became a case study that aviation schools still teach today, though usually without knowing the full story. The F4U Corsair flew its last combat missions in 1969 during the football war between Honduras and El Salvador, 26 years after Robert Hanson proved that the dive technique worked over Bougainville. The fighters used in that brief conflict were F4U 5 seconds and F4U 7 seconds. Variants developed long after the war ended, but the basic airframe remained recognizable. The same bent wings, the same R-2800 engine architecture, though refined to produce 2,800 horsepower, the same capacity for high-speed dives. And the pilots flying those final combat missions used throttle management techniques during dive recoveries that traced directly back to what Eddie Burkhart had worked out in a maintenance tent in 1943. The knowledge had become so thoroughly institutionalized that nobody questioned it anymore. It was simply how you flew the aircraft. But the story's real significance wasn't about one technique or one aircraft. It was about how combat organizations learn, adapt, and survive when the gap between doctrine and reality becomes too large to ignore. The United States military entered World War II with fighter tactics and procedures developed during peacetime. Test pilots had explored aircraft capabilities within the boundaries that peacetime safety considerations demanded. Engineers had calculated performance envelopes based on theoretical models. Manuals had been written by people who understood aviation but had never experienced combat. All of that knowledge was valuable. All of it was based on sound engineering principles and legitimate safety concerns, and much of it turned out to be wrong in ways that only combat could reveal. The problem wasn't that the engineers were incompetent or that the test pilots were careless. The problem was that combat created conditions that peacetime testing couldn't replicate, not because of lack of imagination, but because of ethical and practical limitations. You couldn't ask test pilots to dive at 500 miles per hour and recover at 5,000 feet 20 times per day for weeks on end until they either perfected the technique or died trying. But that's exactly what combat pilots had to do. And in that crucible, they discovered things that testing had missed. The Corsair dive technique was one example. Charles Lindbergh's fuel efficiency methods that transformed marine aviation in 1944 were another. The thatch-weave fighter tactic developed at Guadalcanal in 1942 was a third. Each represented knowledge that emerged from combat necessity rather than peacetime planning. And in each case, the institutional response followed a similar pattern. Initial resistance from established authority, skepticism about field modifications to approved procedures. Demands for proof that the new technique was better than the old one. Eventually, grudging acknowledgement that combat results couldn't be ignored. Finally, adoption of the new technique as standard procedure, often without acknowledging that the original procedures had been inadequate. This pattern repeated itself in every subsequent American conflict: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan. Each time, combat revealed gaps between doctrine and reality. Each time, people in the field developed adaptations. Each time, the institutional response mixed resistance with eventual acceptance. The F-4 Phantom in Vietnam lacked an internal gun because designers believed missiles had made dogfighting obsolete. Combat proved otherwise. Pilots developed tactics to compensate, and eventually the Air Force added gun pods, while the Navy brought back dedicated fighter training at Top Gun. The doctrine changed, but only after combat forced the change. The A-10 Warthog was nearly cancelled multiple times because it didn't fit the Air Force's vision of modern warfare. Ground troops in Iraq and Afghanistan kept requesting it because it provided close air support in ways that high-speed jets couldn't match. The aircraft survived because combat effectiveness mattered more than theoretical preferences. The pattern Eddie Burkhart encountered in 1943, where institutional resistance met combat necessity, has played out repeatedly across 8 decades of American military aviation. The names change, the aircraft change, the specific technical issues change, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. Official doctrine represents the best knowledge available before combat. Combat reveals whether that knowledge is adequate. Field adaptations emerge when it isn't. The institution either accepts those adaptations or continues losing people until the evidence becomes overwhelming. The Corsair story represents a relatively quick institutional adaptation. 4 months from when Burkhart first worked out the physics to when the Navy issued Technical Bulletin 437. In military terms, that's nearly instantaneous. Other adaptations took years. Some never happened at all, and people died because bureaucratic inertia proved stronger than combat evidence. What made the Corsair case different was the combination of several factors. A mechanic who understood both the physics and the practical realities. Pilots willing to trust non-standard procedures when their lives depended on the outcome. A squadron commander who recognized that combat results mattered more than regulatory compliance, and a problem that was killing enough people that the institution couldn't ignore it. Remove any of those elements, and the story might have ended differently. Burkhart's technique might have remained a local adaptation used by one squadron. The official manuals might never have changed, and pilots in other squadrons would have continued dying in dive recoveries while following approved procedures that didn't work. By 1945, the Corsair had compiled a combat record that made it one of the most successful fighter aircraft of the war. 12,571 aircraft, produced across all variants, 2,140 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat against 189 Corsairs lost to enemy fighters, an 11.3-to-1 kill ratio that stood as one of the war's most dominant fighter performances, 64,051 combat sorties flown, 15,621 tons of bombs delivered, countless ground targets destroyed, ships attacked, enemy positions suppressed. All the roles that made the Corsair not just a fighter but a complete weapon system. But underneath those impressive statistics existed thousands of individual moments. Pilots diving from altitude, throttles moving to 60% power, airspeed indicators swinging past 500 miles per hour, targets growing larger in gun sights, triggers pressed, recoveries executed with smooth back pressure and gradual throttle advance, climbs back to altitude to do it all again. Each of those moments represented a pilot who'd learned a technique that wasn't in the original manuals, a technique that worked because someone had been willing to question whether the official way was the right way, a technique that spread through informal channels before the institution acknowledged its value. The mathematics were straightforward once you understood them. Torque increases with RPM and manifold pressure. At high airspeeds, propeller efficiency changes. Control authority varies with dynamic pressure. Recovery g-forces multiply with airspeed. The equations weren't complex. They just described reality in ways that theoretical peacetime calculations had missed. Eddie Burkhart's contribution was recognizing that the gap between theory and practice mattered, that combat pilots were dying not because they were making mistakes, but because they were following procedures that didn't account for conditions the procedure writers had never experienced. That the solution required questioning assumptions rather than blaming execution. That kind of thinking doesn't come naturally to large organizations. Institutions prefer stability. They value established procedures because procedures represent accumulated wisdom. They resist change because change implies that previous decisions were wrong, and admitting error threatens institutional authority. But combat doesn't care about institutional preferences. Combat has its own logic. Follow procedures that work and survive. Follow procedures that don't work and die. The feedback is immediate, unambiguous, and final. In that environment, institutional resistance becomes a luxury that organizations can't afford. Either they adapt based on combat evidence, or they continue losing people until the evidence becomes so overwhelming that adaptation is unavoidable. The only variable is how much time and how many lives it takes to reach that point. The Corsair dive technique represented relatively quick adaptation. 4 months from field innovation to official acceptance. But those 4 months included pilots dying while following approved procedures, included families receiving telegrams about training accidents or combat losses that might have been preventable if the institution had moved faster, included squadron commanders writing letters trying to explain why good pilots were dying in circumstances that seemed like they should have been survivable. The cost of institutional inertia isn't abstract. It's measured in lives and in letters to families, and in the knowledge that better procedures existed but weren't approved in time to matter. 20 years after the war ended, the Naval Aviation School's Command published a study examining fighter tactics evolution during World War II. The study included a section on the Corsair dive recovery technique. The authors noted that the original procedures in the flight manuals had been based on inadequate understanding of high-speed dive characteristics under combat conditions. That was the closest the institution ever came to acknowledging that the original procedures had been wrong, not incompetent, not negligent, just inadequate in ways that only combat revealed. The study went on to recommend that future fighter aircraft development include more realistic combat profiles during testing. That peacetime test protocols should try to anticipate combat conditions rather than assuming that combat would simply involve peacetime procedures executed faster. It was a reasonable recommendation. It was probably even implemented for a few years. But institutional memory is short. By the time the F-4 Phantom entered service in Vietnam, many of the lessons from World War II had been forgotten. New assumptions had replaced old ones. And a new generation of pilots had to relearn through combat experience that doctrine doesn't always match reality. The cycle continues. It will probably always continue, because the gap between peacetime planning and combat reality is fundamentally unbridgeable. You can narrow it. You can learn from previous conflicts. You can try to anticipate conditions that testing can't replicate. But you can't eliminate the gap entirely because combat creates its own dynamics that peacetime can't fully capture. What you can do is recognize that the gap exists. Build organizations that are capable of rapid adaptation when combat reveals inadequacies. Value field innovations from people who understand practical realities, even when those innovations contradict established doctrine. Accept that procedures will need to change based on combat evidence, and create systems that allow that change to happen before too many people die. That's the real lesson from Eddie Burkhart and the Corsair dive technique. Not that institutions are stupid or that manuals are useless, but that combat teaches lessons that peacetime can't anticipate, and the organizations that survive are the ones that learn fastest from those lessons. The F4U Corsair flew in combat for 26 years, from Guadalcanal in 1943 to the Football War in 1969. It served in 2 major wars and several smaller conflicts. It operated from carrier decks and from primitive coral runways. It fought as a pure fighter and as a fighter bomber. It flew in the hands of Americans, British, French, New Zealanders, and Central American air forces. Through all those years and all those missions, pilots used throttle management techniques during high-speed dives that traced back to what a 41-year-old mechanic worked out in a maintenance tent on a primitive airfield in the Solomon Islands. The technique that should have been in the original manuals but wasn't. The technique that emerged from combat necessity rather than peacetime planning. The technique that saved an unknown number of lives by teaching pilots to trust physics over instinct. Eddie Burkhart died in 1972 at age 70. His obituary in the Tulsa newspaper noted his military service and his post-war aircraft repair business. It didn't mention the Corsair dive technique. That piece of history existed in technical bulletins and in scattered references in combat after-action reports. It existed in the memories of pilots who'd flown Corsairs and understood that something about their dive recovery procedures was different from what other fighters used. But it didn't exist in the popular history of the aircraft. When aviation enthusiasts talked about the Corsair's bent wings, or its distinctive sound, or its impressive kill ratio, they didn't usually discuss the throttle management technique that helped make that kill ratio possible. The story was too technical, too mundane, too focused on procedures rather than heroics. Yet that story mattered as much as any of the more dramatic elements, because the Corsair's success didn't just come from having the right engine, or the right weapons, or the right airframe. It came from having pilots who understood how to use those capabilities in ways that kept them alive long enough to become effective. And that understanding came not from manuals or training programs, but from people who were willing to question whether the official way was working and to develop alternatives when it wasn't. The final irony is that the technique eventually became so thoroughly institutionalized that it stopped being revolutionary. By the 1950s, when young pilots learned to fly jets, the throttle management principles that Burkhart had worked out were just part of the standard curriculum. Nobody thought to question them because they'd always been taught that way. The revolutionary had become routine. The innovation had become doctrine, which is probably how it should be. The point of combat innovations isn't to remain special or to be remembered as innovations. The point is to become standard practice so thoroughly that future generations never have to relearn the lesson at the cost of their own lives. Eddie Burkhart would probably have appreciated that outcome. His goal in September 1943 wasn't fame or recognition. It was stopping pilots from dying in dive recoveries. Once the technique was adopted and the deaths stopped, the job was done. Whether anyone remembered where the technique came from mattered less than whether it worked. And it worked. For 26 years of combat operations, for thousands of pilots, for tens of thousands of missions. It worked because the physics was sound and because people were willing to trust mathematics over instinct. It worked because a mechanic understood that sometimes the best way to honor institutional knowledge is to question it when combat evidence suggests it's inadequate. The bent-wing Corsair remains one of aviation's most recognizable silhouettes. Museums display them, air shows feature them, historians write about them. The aircraft's legacy is secure in ways that ensure it will be remembered long after the last people who flew them in combat have passed away. But the complete story includes more than just the aircraft's capabilities. It includes the human systems that allowed those capabilities to be used effectively, the mechanics who understood engines, the pilots who were willing to try new techniques when established procedures weren't working, the commanders who valued combat results over regulatory compliance, the institutions that eventually accepted that field innovations might be right even when they contradicted official doctrine. All of those elements contributed to the Corsair's success. Remove any of them, and the story might have been different. The aircraft might have remained a promising design that somehow never lived up to its potential. Pilots might have continued dying in dive recoveries while engineers struggled to understand why. The war might have lasted longer because American fighters weren't as effective as they could have been. Instead, the story went differently. Adapted, knowledge spread, procedures changed, and the fighter that had been designed in 1938 became one of the most successful combat aircraft of the 20th century, not just because of its engineering, but because of the human systems that allowed that engineering to be used properly. That's the story the museums don't always tell. The story about procedures and techniques and the willingness to question assumptions. The story about mechanics and manuals and the gap between doctrine and reality. The story about how combat organizations learn when survival depends on getting it right. The story about throttle management during high-speed dives might not be as dramatic as dogfights over Rabaul or as visually impressive as a Corsair's bent-wing silhouette, but it mattered just as much to the pilots whose lives depended on whether their aircraft would respond properly when they most needed it to. And in the end, that's what aviation has always been about. Not just the machines, but the knowledge of how to use them. Not just the engineering, but the techniques that make the engineering effective. Not just the doctrine, but the willingness to question doctrine when combat proves it inadequate. Eddie Burkhart understood that in September 1943, the pilots who trusted his technique understood it. The institution eventually understood it. And 8 decades later, that understanding remains relevant every time someone questions whether the established way is the right way and has the courage to work out an alternative when the evidence suggests it isn't. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.